titled Clear Electoral Rules and Procedures and Independent Electoral Arbitrators. First steps of electoral integrity. It is a key in Latin America. It's a question we have opened. Our moderator in this case is Professor Alarcón. Professor Alarcón is the founder of the Center of Political Studies at the Universidad Católica Andrés Bello. He's founder and director. The center that is also co-sponsor of this event. He's also the director of the Electoral Integrity Venezuelan project of that center and received 3 master's degrees in public management, international economic law, and security and defense. So, thank you, Professor Alarcón.
Good afternoon, everybody. I don't know why Daniela put me in this position today, but I will try to do my best. I have with me Gabriela Taruco and Miriam Comblit. Mariela Taruco, excuse me if my pronunciation is not right, is a professor of the Department of Political Science at the Universidade Federal de Pernambuco. I did it well? Okay. Brazil. Her research focuses on electoral governance and party system in Latin America. She holds a PhD in political science from Instituto Universitário de Pesquisas do Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. She has been a visiting scholar at Kellogg Institute between 2005 and 2006, and also at the University of Pittsburgh in 2014. Her articles have appeared in Election Law Journal and in some Brazilian journals like Brazilian Political Science Review. And Miriam Comblit is Director for Latin America and the Caribbean at the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington since 2016. She is sociologist from the Universidad Católica Andrés Bello, my university. She was professor and researcher at the Center for Development Studies at the Institute of Political Studies, both from the Universidad Central of Venezuela, a visitor scholar at the Center for Latin American Studies at the Stanford University in California, the Institute for Advanced Management Studies, IESA, in Caracas, and the Kellogg Institute for International Relations at the University of Notre Dame, Indiana. Published extensively on contemporary Venezuelan political system, on constitutional reforms, Paris elections and change of political regime. Vice President and member of the Board of Directors of the National Electoral Council of Venezuela between 1998 and 1999. We are here to try to answer, I think, a very difficult question. Is it achieve the electoral integrity in Latin America? And we are going to begin with Miriam Comblit to try to answer this question. So go ahead. Thank you.
So, how do I handle the presentation? ¿Cómo hago para usarlo? ¿Cómo tú prefieres? Sí, no, bueno, yo lo que quiera.
Si necesitas ayuda, dime.
Okay, so thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Daniela, for inviting me, and thank you very much to the organizer of this event for inviting me. I will not answer the question, I have to say, and basically, I would like to focus my presentation on the last aspect, which is the independent electoral arbitrators. Actually, I was independent electoral arbiter referee in Venezuela. I was a member, vice president of the Electoral Council in Venezuela from 1998 and 1999. So this is a theme, a topic that is very close to my experience and my heart. So that's something that caught my attention when I was invited to this presentation. So, it has already been mentioned that, I mean, there is a high degree of professionalization in terms of the electoral authorities in Latin America. The electoral management bodies have evolved significantly. They have been, they conduct elections in a very sophisticated, very technical fashion. And there has been a lot of discussion regarding the most appropriate design of electoral bodies in Latin America. Latin America has opted, most of the countries in Latin America have opted for independent bodies. That means bodies that are independent basically from the executive branch. And in Latin America, most of the electoral bodies are independent. Some of them have some kind of mixed design. They partially may depend on the executive branch and may have like an independent aspect to them. Some of them are more tied to the judiciary. However, the trend, the majority of the countries in Latin America have independent bodies, electoral bodies. On the other hand, there has been a lot of discussion in the region regarding the nature of the members of the electoral bodies. I mean, are they appointed, are they political? Are they members that come directly from parties? Or are there experts, or are they selected in a fashion that ensures that they are independent, even though they may have some kind of institutional or political affiliation? In general, what we have seen in the region too is that there is a preference for electoral management bodies comprised of experts, of non-partisan members. So there has been a lot of discussion and I would say experience and experimentation in terms of the composition of the electoral bodies, their design, their institutional affiliation, and say there is, I would say, kind of a consensus in the region that independent bodies and non-partisan bodies are better for democracy and are better for electoral integrity. However, I mean, there are different cases there that can, that come out of the general rule, but this is what has happened in the region. And we have to remember that many of the countries or many of the electoral processes, and especially the electoral bodies, were established after the third wave of democracy in the region, when many countries re-democratized and some of them democratized for the first time. So the way those bodies were established was very closely tied to the efforts of generating like a new democratic pattern and system in the region, and took those ideas from the international community and also from the previous experience in each country in regards to what was the best setting and the best institutional design for electoral bodies. On the other hand, if you read and you go through the scholarly literature in regards to electoral bodies, you can find like two sets of research. Some of them consider the electoral bodies as the electoral management bodies as the dependent variable. And the question is, what are the factors that influence the ability of the electoral bodies to perform their duties in an impartial and effective way? So is it the nature of their composition? Is it the institutional setting of the country? Is it the length of democracy in the country? Is it the strength of rule of law and democracy? So the question is, how can we explain the effectiveness and the capacity of existing electoral bodies? So in that sense, I mean, some of the papers, and some of them are very interesting, well known, are focused on explaining why electoral bodies perform well or badly. Then we also have another set of papers and scholarly research focusing on electoral bodies as the independent variable, as one of the factors that can explain the quality and the quality of elections in the region, the integrity of the elections in the region. There are many factors, so having an independent body can explain having an effective election. Having selected independent bodies through a certain mechanism has an impact on the outcome. Among the different factors that can explain the result of an election, what is the role of having certain kind of electoral body? So, I mean, there has been like a interesting and healthy attention to electoral bodies, which not only has an scholarly and research meaning and impact, but also a policy meaning, because the responses we give to the importance of electoral bodies, whether as independent variables or independent factors or factors that depend on other variables, has implications in terms of institutional design, institutional reform, and in terms of further along the line on the strength of democracy. So I just wanted to bring this to highlight that there has been a lot of attention in regards to electoral bodies in the region. It is a topic addressed both from the policy perspective and the scholarly and research perspective, and it is at the center of the discussions in regards to elections. My approach here, because I mean we can go into all the details about the electoral bodies and the best design and all that, but I'll leave that to the experts. But I wanted to talk more about more of the context, maybe following Professor Pipa Morris's presentation. So it's more about how are electoral bodies perceived in Latin America, and how are elections perceived. And I will use data coming out of the Electoral Integrity Project and also from Latino Barometro and Barometro de Americas. So I'll start with the perceptions of electoral officials. The first set of data comes from the Electoral Integrity Project. So when I asked my question in regards to the indicators, you can find in the Electoral Integrity Project 49 overall indicators, 4 of which are related to electoral bodies. So I'll read the indicators. I only took 2 of them, but the indicators in the Electoral Integrity Project are: one question is election officials were fair, and then there are 3 that belong to a category devoted exclusively to electoral authorities, which is: one is the authorities distributed information to citizens, the authorities allowed public scrutiny of their performance, and the third is the elections authority performed well. So I just picked 2 of those indicators, which I thought were, say, more telling. The first is election officials were fair, and the second was the election authorities performed well. So these are the scores in regards to these 2 indicators. And this is, I mean, the horizontal lines are the averages, the respective averages for the region. So here you have the view for the region in regards to the experts' perceptions of electoral authorities. And as you heard Professor Pipa Morris said, maybe these indicators are not enough, don't cover the whole, the whole scope of what the electoral authorities do, or the different aspects that they could be assessed by, but well, these are the ones that the electoral integrity program has. So here you can see obviously some countries perform above average, some below. Overall, well, the score is, I would say, pretty high, above 60%. And there seems to be like a relatively positive assessment of the fairness and the performance of election officials in the region. And well, there are the overperformers, the good performers, which are almost consistently Uruguay and Costa Rica and Chile, and then we also have Argentina, Brazil. I mean, those that are above average, Panama, and Guatemala a little bit, and Mexico a little bit too. So well, this is like the overall view of in a certain year in 2018. Let's see what's the over time. I mean, based on the existing electoral integrity programs. Well, over time, we see some changes. We see a slight decay, actually. If you see the dotted line, that's the average. And so we can see a slight, well, depending on how we wanna name it, slight or acute, but I would say it's a slight decay in terms of the assessments that experts do in regards to the performance and the fairness of electoral authorities. And it seems to be like the decline is a little bit more pronounced in terms of the fairness, but I wouldn't take that, well, I guess we have to check with Pipa Norris, but I don't know to what extent that's very clearly differentiated in the questions, but anyway, if we take it at face value, there's a less positive assessment in terms of the fairness compared to the performance. And then, well, of course, we have some of those that are always at the top, which are the ones I already mentioned, and some that have, experienced some acute decay, particularly the case of Venezuela is very salient. And well, and you can, well, this is going to be available, and so you can have all the graphs, but here we can see the evolution throughout these surveys. And here I just wanted to show like the best performing, the changes and those that are basically those which the greatest change, both in positive and negative sense. So just to show that even though there's a regional average, of course, this includes like variations among countries. But, and well, you can, each one may know each one of the countries in depth and can, draw their own conclusions. And, sorry. So this is in regards to the perceptions. From the experts' point of view, I think there are two conclusions. One is that the perception is, I would say, basically positive for the region. And secondly, that they're capturing or there is a decay there is a decline in terms of the evaluation. Slight, but there is a decline. So let's see, now I'd like to show some decline in terms of the fairness and performance of electoral authorities. Here we are concentrated exclusively in electoral authorities, not in the overall performance of elections. Now let's see what happens in terms of how ordinary people see how ordinary people assess the electoral bodies. So I'm using Latino Barometro, and here we can see, we can have a different picture. In 2006, the assessment of, the question here, in Spanish, ¿Cuánta confianza tiene usted? O sea, how much do you trust electoral bodies? And in 2006, 51% had a positive, trusted electoral bodies, and this has declined to 29%. So here we can see first, again, first in contrast to the previous assessment, the assessment in this case of ordinary citizens is much less positive. And we can see like a sustained decline throughout the years. So this is the representation. I think in changing the format, there was some change in distortion in the numbers, but I mean, basically, this is the representation of this, but I think there's some problems there. But anyway, I won't go into this because I detected a problem in the changing the format. But anyway, again, what I want to show here is that, well, each country has a different situation, obviously, but however, the trend is that people in the countries are, even in the best performing countries, are assessing their electoral bodies in lesser positive terms throughout the past decade. And I know I have very few minutes left, so okay. So then to complete this, I'd like to just show, and this is based on America's Barometer, the perception in terms of trust in elections. Again, as I said, electoral bodies can be understood as independent variables or dependent variables in terms of they may shape elections or the electoral system may shape their ability to perform, but however, whether we consider them dependent or independent variables, they are tied to elections. And obviously, because they are electoral management bodies. And what we see, again, is a decrease in a decline in the way people are, in the trust of people throughout the region in regards to elections. ¿Hasta qué punto tiene usted confianza en las elecciones en este país? I mean, to what extent you trust elections in this country? And here you see a decline. It's not such an acute decline as we saw in the previous one in terms of the trust of institutions on the electoral bodies and electoral tribunal or council, but there is a decline in terms of trust in elections. And again, here we can see, well, those that are performing at a very high level and again are perceived as trustworthy elections in the case of Uruguay, but we can see declines in others, which are Uruguay, Costa Rica always perform very well, but other countries are seeing like declines in the way people perceive elections. So I wanted to, present this in terms of like the different ways of assessing the ability of the electoral bodies to carry out their main functions, and without establishing a correlation, because it all depends how we treat them, whether as independent or dependent variables, but we could establish some kind of association with trust in elections. And finally, just the perceptions of democracy. Based on Latino Barometro, what we are seeing is a consistent loss of trust and democracy in the region. Here we have an increase in those that are indifferent in regards to what's your preferred system. La democracia es preferible a cualquier otra forma de gobierno, so, and there's a decline, slow, but as Latino Barometro says, it's like a diabetes, which is, causing slow and quiet problems. However, I think the region has problems that are not quiet or slow, such as the case of Venezuela or Nicaragua. But anyway, as a whole, as an average, we are seeing like a less support for democracy. We are seeing also less trust that it is the best regime. Since 2013, we have gone from 79% to 69% who have a solid and a clear appreciation for democracy in the region. And finally, the satisfaction with democracy has declined significantly. We have lack of satisfaction grown in a very significant fashion, and satisfaction has declined significantly. So without, at this moment, establishing relations between those three variables, the trust capacity of electoral bodies, the quality or trust in elections, and the quality and trust in democracy, we can see that there is a problem there. I mean, basically, there is a decline in terms of popular perceptions of those three elements, which are obviously critical for democracy in the region. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Daniela, for inviting me. Thank you all for being here until now. I'm not going to answer your question either. It's a very difficult question, but I think Professor Norris had already answered, at least partially, before, when she showed that maps with multiple colors. So we can see in Latin America, electoral integrity presents a huge variation. You could see countries light green, dark green, and pink. So I think we have a kind of answer, and would be, it depends. Electoral integrity is being achieved in some countries more than others. So I think I would be able to make some contribution showing some research on why we have this variation. So I am looking for the reasons for this variation. And this is a list of questions that research questions on this subject. Many of you probably are engaged in these research questions. There are a lot of people working on that. And I am trying to participate in this debate also. And the first thing we have to do as a scholar community looking for these answers is if you have to answer how free and fair are elections in Latin America, we should know how to, where to search this, where to find these answers. It's not easy to know if an election is free and fair, because sometimes malpractices or frauds are not, if they are efficient, we'll never know. So it's a kind of subject difficult to study, like corruption. So we have to find ways to measure the quality of elections. And one way to measure this is the perception. So we can measure the quality of elections through perceptions of quality from experts, from politicians, from people, from practitioners. So perceptions are one way to measure this. And other thing is that to conduct free and fair elections is a kind of difficult task, and institutions need to have capacity to do that. And so we could search this answer in the capacity of EMBs. And particularly, I would like to answer these two last questions. And I'd like to know if institutions matter for this, for electoral integrity, and specifically one kind of institutions that is the partisanship, the partisan power sharing in the electoral governance. Let's see if I can answer some questions about that. So this subject on political parties and EMBs is a subject of kind of controversy in the literature. Well, the question is, institutions of electoral governance can be more partisan or less partisan. Political parties can be responsible for appoint the members, all of them, and they can do this directly or through legislature. Or political parties can be totally out of this process, and in many countries they cannot appoint any member. And sometimes, in some institutions, political parties appoint a part of the members, not all members. So this is a kind of, I use this criteria to code electoral institutions in Latin America. And the debate is, which model is better to produce free and fair elections? And the controversy is that power sharing in macro institutions like proportional representation has many advantages because put actors together to participate in decision process, produces transparency and checks and balances and mutual control. But in electoral governance, partisan power sharing could maybe put too much power in actors who have interest in the competition. So would be kind of let the fox take care of hen house. Do you have this expression here also? So there is this kind of controversy, and would be great if Miguel Otaola was here, because he has a very interesting paper on this, and he found that politicians perceive his variable is perception of politicians, and his findings are pro-partisan power sharing. So the quality of elections is seen as good. Free elections are perceived as free and fair by politicians, even in situations when political parties appoint members. But there is a lot of controversy, and I have different results, and I'm going to show you. So, to discuss this, I made an empirical effort, and I collected data on legislative elections in 18 countries in Latin America, and these elections since democratization of each country until 2015, and I am now trying to update this data set. And I use the constitutions and electoral laws of each country, each law and constitution that was working in the year of that each election. So it was a lot of reading and coding, and I did that. And now I'm going to show you some partial results and some other questions I don't have answers yet. So I can tell you today, I can describe institutions of electoral governance in Latin America, and I can try to say something about the effect of partisan power sharing in electoral governance on concerns about the fairness of elections. This is a kind of proxy. Well, if we cannot measure directly the quality of elections, some proxies, we can use some proxies. So there is this variable called concerns. I'm going to show you in a moment. There are that measures how much there are suspicions on the quality of elections. So we can try to say if there are suspicions, the elections would not be good. I can show you some association between post-electoral protests and partisan model of electoral governance. I cannot explain the relationship between delegation to non-partisan actors and the files. So this number 4, I don't have answers yet, but I'm going to share it with you. Maybe you can have some ideas. And finally, this is my research agenda. The last point is about the reforms. Many countries are changing their models toward non-partisan actors in electoral governance. Well, this is the first description. This graph shows the unity here is the legislative election. We have for this graph kind of 180 elections for each country since democratization until 2015. And each bar is a feature of electoral governance, an aspect, a characteristic. So the first one is independence from the executive. So we can see that of all elections in Latin America in this period, 70% was conducted by independent EMBs. EMBs not related to executive branch. And 20% of elections conducted by EMBs attached to executive branch, and some 10% partial, like executive can appoint some members of the EMB. And each bar is one of these 6 dimensions of electoral governance. I took these dimensions from a very famous paper from Mozaffar and Schadler, and I had to adapt the coding for operational issues. So the second one is regulation. This dimension means that the law that regulates each election could be in the ordinary law or in ordinary law and constitution. So I would say that electoral governance is strongly regulated when the rules are in both kind of laws or not so strongly regulated. So kind of 70% of these elections all this time happened under strong regulation or with constitution, rules in the constitution. This third one is delegation. Delegation is that dimension that means that political parties delegate electoral governance to non-partisan actors. So political parties, when they were making rules through the legislative activity, they delegate electoral governance to judicial branch or experts or non-partisan actors. So in this set of elections, only 30-something% of elections were conducted by EMBs non-partisan EMBs. And the others had some participation of political parties in electoral governance. Specialization is when the same institution can adjudicate and manage elections, or these two tasks can be separated into different institutions. And for example, in Brazil, we have one institution, the Tribunal Superior Electoral, and they do both things. They manage elections and they adjudicate questions. So they are not specialized. In some countries, we have 2 institutions specialized. Centralization is when we have one unique institutions in all country, and decentralized that's when the organization, the management is autonomously conducted in each provincia or departmental state. And bureaucratization is about the time of duration of each electoral commission. So you can have a permanent bureaucracy or ad hoc commissions, electoral commissions that are formed and dissolved at each election. Each of these dimensions have can be seen as problems or as solutions. You can think good things or bad things about them, about each one, and it's not my role to decide that. I'm just describing. So there is a lot of variation in many dimensions of electoral governance. So now I'm trying to know why this is so diverse. I'm trying to explain the variation. Here is a result I got in a part of this research, and I use this question from NELDA dataset. The question is, before election, are there significant concerns that election will not be free and fair? This is that proxy on suspicions. I don't know if the election is free and fair or not, but I know if there are significant concerns before the election. So this is my dependent variable, and I try with all that dimensions coded from constitutions and laws, and my result is that elections conducted by EMBs non-partisan, that when we have full delegation to non-partisan actors, this decreases the probability that an election will be not considered free and fair, or there will be concerns on free and fair elections. And this is for my hypothesis, this is a good result, because my hypothesis is that political parties are folks taking care of in-house. But this is not the same. Other research from other authors, they find different results. This is my one. Well, I try to do this in other two fronts. This is about post-electoral protests. So I could code if each election was or wasn't followed by a protest, mainly by the opposition parties, after the election against the results. And I had an hypothesis that political parties participating in electoral governance would be a necessary condition for protests, because my hypothesis is that political parties is a vulnerability to quality of elections. But I find something near this. So I would like to find that always you have post-electoral protests, you had political parties organizing elections. Not this. I found that in almost all cases of post-electoral protests, we have political parties organizing elections. So I cannot conclude that partisanship of EMB are a necessary condition in a deterministic way, but I could try to say that this is a probabilistic necessary condition, because it's 94% in the cases. This is a result I don't know how to explain. This is my current challenge in this research agenda. In this research, I was trying to explain defiance and compliance. On VDEM dataset, there is a question about loser accepting the results. So I was trying to see that the compliance would be more, we would find more compliance or more defiance depending on participation of political parties in electoral governance. And I found that delegation reduces the probability of acceptance. My probability is full delegation doesn't increase acceptance. Sorry, thank you. So I would. This is not what I was expecting to find. So this is my current challenge in this research. I don't know why this is against the former findings. So this just to show you that how difficult is that. And the last thing to do is understand a movement of reform. Some countries started their democratic period with a partisan model of electoral governance. But after that, they changed this. They made reforms towards delegation, reforms that removed political parties from electoral governance or reduced their importance. And we have 4 countries with this kind of reforms. And these are the countries. And here you can see these graphs most show 2 variables from VDEM dataset. These 2 variables are about the quality of elections measured through perception of experts. And these both indexes are available at the VDEM dataset. And this is the 4 countries that made this kind of reform toward delegation. And, well, you know that this vertical line is the moment of the reform. And now, the challenge now is to know why political parties, as legislators, are makers, why they give up, why they delegate electoral governance to non-partisan actors. And after that, the next challenge is to find if these reforms change the dynamics of these indicators of quality of elections. So these are my questions. I don't have answers, I have questions, sorry, Daniela. And here is, is a blog. I'm sorry, it's in Portuguese, but here you can search for links. So there are the data in Excel sheets. You can download the data and replicate the tests or just get to know the data. Is available online in this address. Thank you.
Since we are running late for our agenda, I think that the best idea is to take no more than 30 minutes for questions and comments. So who wants to start? Go ahead, please.
Thank you. I guess the data that Professor Miriam Cornish has shown may be interpreted that there is some gap of confidence in electoral institution between the expert on the one hand in the perception of electoral integrity and on the other of the common people in Latino Barometro. I would like both of you maybe to make a reflection about that. What does that mean, and what does that mean that we are wrong to focus about reforms of electoral system and to make the electoral integrity better, or and we should maybe do more information or something like that for people to trust more on electoral institution, or I don't know.
I have a question too, so I'll go ahead and ask it. For Miriam, in terms of your experience, we all know that you had a major role in administering and executing elections in Venezuela. Apart from the more institutional frameworks that generate certainty and trust on the part of the electorate, what other factors would you say can contribute, or that we can learn of and think of, to strengthen the trust that the citizenship have on the electoral management body? And then a very interesting research, and I see that it's ongoing research that you are, it will be interesting to see what results you get. But I saw that the models that you have in terms of determining who the electoral authorities in one of those bodies, but wouldn't you say that there's always political parties behind it, no matter, you were saying that one is a purely political, another one is more independent, people are appointed, but wouldn't you say that political parties and politicians are always behind it? And if that's the case, if you think that's the case, how do you protect the determination of who the authorities are from the influence of political parties in the mid and long term?
I want to ask to Gabriela, which treatment you give to electoral management bodies who are independent by law, but clearly controlled by parties or governments? For example, in Venezuela, who is independently, theoretically, but in fact, very controlled by the government. And we have many cases in Latin America where we have this gap.
Oh, thank you. Miriam, you use a chart in which I am thinking for a lot from Latino Barometro, according to which, even though the Latin American economy improved between 2016 and 2017, trust in democracy declined. So I was thinking for a while what can explain that, and maybe a possible explanation is that the decline on democratic support is not based on economic grievance, but on the distrust towards a political system. So I want to know a little bit more of your opinion about that.
Yes, you said that there's a decline slightly or big of fairness or performance or trust of people about this issue. Can you explain why? Although that you mentioned that there are some reforms and there are many efforts of organization like last presentation. So why we did a lot of things with reforms, with our works, but there's still a decline exist. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, let's listen the answer for this question. If it's necessary, we can open another round, okay? Go ahead.
Okay. Okay, so, well, thank you very much for the questions. I forgot to mention that I'm very pleased to be in the same panel with Gabriela. Both of us were visiting fellows at the same time at the University of Notre Dame, and we had a great time there. So, so it's great to be. Thank you, Daniela, for have invited us and connected us again. Yeah. So it's. I mean, besides being with, among other friends, this is very special to be with Gabriela here. I mean, all the questions are very difficult, and I'm not sure I have answers. But I was when I saw the indicators from the Electoral Integrity Project compared to Latino Barometro, I was puzzled myself because, I mean, there is a big gap. And I guess, I mean, I myself have provided like inputs in regards to elections. I mean, in the case of Venezuela, everything was horrible. So, I mean, there was no gap. I mean, basically, there is a gap because from my perception as, say, an electoral expert, things are much more worse than what people convey, because after all, considering how bad elections are in Venezuela, if you see the figures, it doesn't seem so bad. I mean, there's a decline, of course, but it's kind of like, in some of them, 40% still think that elections in Venezuela are well run. So there is a gap. I mean, there is a gap based on expertise, on knowledge, but I mean, maybe it's easier to explain why an expert may see wrong when people don't see wrong than why people may see wrong when experts see things running well. But again, I mean, the literature in regards to all these aspects is that, and there are some, even there's an interesting report comparing South Korea and Mexico in regards to the performance of electoral bodies. And one of the conclusions is that there are more context-related variables that have an impact on the way people perceive the performance of the electoral bodies than institutional variables. So if you have a situation, and maybe this applies to what the other questions, if you have a situation whereby there are massive corruption scandals, or there's huge polarization, or there are divided elites, or there are, I don't know, all the things that are happening in different countries, some of them all together, some of them with one of them, those aspects have an influence, have an impact on the way people perceive, in general, the performance of institutions, and particularly electoral institutions. I know this is a very vague answer, but I think the message is that we should not abandon reform, because, of course, having solid electoral bodies is much better than having weak electoral bodies, but that is not enough. That is a necessary condition, but it's not enough to support a positive perception of elections, to carry out sound elections, and to strengthen democracy. I mean, it is a necessary condition, I have no doubt about it, but it's not enough. Which, again, we shouldn't abandon efforts to improve the quality of electoral bodies, but we should be aware that we may be disappointed that that is not sufficient. But well, do you want? I can go back to other questions.
No, it's okay. You can.
Okay. So, well, thank you, Matilde, for your questions. Well, while I was there, I mean, it was always, I mean, there was an ongoing assessment of what was going on. And I would like to go to Gabriela's last question, because what happened in Venezuela in 1997, I mean, with the new electoral law, and that was slightly reformed in 1998, and that was the one that allowed me to become a member of the Electoral Council. I mean, that law came as a result of an awareness of a good part of the political elite that there was a crisis of legitimacy and a crisis of trust in institutions, which, after all, was clearly proven by the election of Chavez in the end of 1998. But the electoral system in Venezuela was facing a deep crisis. One of the components of that crisis was the lack of trust in electoral institutions. And if you see the surveys of the period, and the Latinobarómetro and any other survey, the trust in electoral institutions and in the electoral process in Venezuela was really low. So the view of the political elite and the intellectual elite was that there was a need to move from a clearly partisan electoral body that had progressively introduced some elements to balance the strictly partisan nature of the body by introducing what they call the independents. But there always were independents pro, Independiente pro AD, Independiente pro COPEI. I mean, it wasn't really independent. So the reform that was put in place in 1997, which was a massive reform, included the departization of electoral bodies and at a whole level, introduction of automatization, introduction of the referendum at the national level, and the institutionalization of what was called the electoral service, which included ordinary citizens and other people to be members of the electoral bodies. And well, it was a very massive and thorough reform, which from a immediate perspective is kind of puzzling, because there were politicians who decided to depoliticize the electoral institution. However, that was their response and their understanding of the need to change in a significant way things that were affecting the legitimacy of the system. That was the time where I was there, and of course the political parties were were also puzzled by what the decision that they had made, and had mixed feelings, because you could always sense the intention of political parties to kind of exercise pressure and kind of try to change things and to influence the political process through back channels, but that was a very strong decision. So, which may trigger some second thoughts, but it was their way to address a critical situation in the country. And actually, that election was assessed as a very, the 1998 election, the presidential election, was assessed as a very free, fair, an election that complied with all these standards, probably due to the result, because nobody, Chavez was not the favorite of the, the traditional parties, but also because, there was a new cadre of electoral authorities there performing their tasks. And in regards to, well, there are so many factors, but I think bottom line is also the honesty of those who are running the bodies. To what extent, whether they're appointed through political parties, they're independent. I think there are some personal traits that have, I would say, like a very, have a strong bearing. But indeed, the institutional and media environment has a big influence. If someone who is running an electoral process feels that he or she will be held accountable, will face sanctions if he or she does not abide by the law, if I think that exercise that has a very important means a lot. The institutional setting may have a very important influence, but bottom line also, the individual characters. And well, in regards to the relationship between economic variables and the influence of economic performance on support for democracy, what can I say? I think that bad economic performance harms democracy, but good economic performance is not enough to support democracy. There's a lot of literature on that, and I think what we have learned over decades of research and analysis and seeing ups and downs is that there's not a linear relationship between economic performance and support for democracy. But there seems to be some consensus that a bad economic performance is not good for democracy. But I know it's not enough as a response, but it happens. I don't know if I responded. I think I. Yeah, sorry. Yes, the explanation of the decline. Again, I think that's associated. I don't think, in general, we can see that electoral processes and electoral bodies are more professional, more professional. There's more knowledge, more technification. So I don't think that there is a decline in terms of the ability of electoral bodies to carry out good elections, with exceptions. Elections in Venezuela are horrible. So there is a decline, but this is a politically motivated decline, not for lack of it is because elections are run very poorly by definition. But in the rest of the countries where there is an attempt to carry out good elections, I think in general those elections are well carried out. However, if people are unhappy with democracy, are feeling that democracy is not satisfying their aspirations, if the environment is very polarized, if you have irresponsible players who will blame the Electoral Commission for problems that may not be associated to the Electoral Commission, if you have, again, a polarized environment, that can affect the perception, because it's perception. the perception of the public about the ability of the electoral bodies to perform in a fair and efficient fashion, despite the fact that they are or not performing elections well. I mean, it is very subjective, but it happens. Again, electoral bodies have to carry out sound elections, good elections, but that is not enough for the people to perceive that those elections are being carried out in a fair and effective way. So it's associated with the decline of a sense of lack of satisfaction with democracy. I think so, and it is associated, but it's still that we still have to look into the specific aspects of the electoral process. But if you have like actors who make the electoral body or the elections responsible for issues that may not be associated with elections, if you have a polarized environment, if you have irresponsible losers that claim that they lost because fraud was committed or they were not treated fairly, all of that has an impact on perceptions.
I would like just to add some details. I agree with Miriam with everything. About the difference between evaluations from people and from experts, and would like to remind that these evaluations are aggregated measures, and so if you have public opinion surveys, this result is a huge is an aggregation of many respondents of this survey, and people who studies this kind of public opinion surveys would be able to explain why people support or not democracy and how this is related with the trust or distrust in electoral management bodies. So at the individual level, we could find answers for this evaluation for people. But I would expect a less variation among experts coding the same election, following the same checklist on elections. I think this is part of the answer. And on reforms or information, and I would say that both, but let me put together the question. This is a debate on the effects of institutions. So I'm trying to find if institutions matter and how they matter, and I'm not able to explain informal features of this independence, for example. So I am coding and measure formal independence, formal partisanship, that institutions in the law, in the constitution and in the law. I know that people in formal independent institutions or no partisan institutions, they have political preferences, of course they have. But I think there is a huge difference between to be a representative appointed by a political party and to be someone who has a political preference. Because if you are directly appointed by a political party, you are accountable for the party, and there is a kind of principal-agent relationship between the appointee and the political party. So, of course, everybody has political preferences, but I think this is not the same thing that to be appointed as a representative of political parties, of a political party. So we are in non-partisan institutions, these members are not there to represent or to defend interest of political parties. In a partisan power sharing model, the idea is that each representative defending their parties. I think it's different. But this is a limitation of this research. I can deal with formal institutions, And this is why I can compare countries, because to answer about informal things, I would have to do case studies, and I would not be able to compare. This is a limitation, and I understand this is, but I cannot solve this for a while. I have some colleagues working on this, doing case studies, and I hope soon we have publications on that, but not me for a while at least. And why reforms? And well, this is a research on institutions. I want to know if institutions matter or not. But politicians, as while lawmakers, they have interest to do something, and so there is a lot of, in the literature, there are a lot of hypotheses on reforms of electoral systems. So I'm going to try to adapt these theories on reforms in electoral systems to find some answers on reforms in electoral governance, like if there are one major party, or if there are many small parties, maybe is more difficult to negotiate among many few parties. And one of these theories are the policy cycle hypothesis is of Professor Pippa Norris. There is a paper where she say that if the public opinion distrust rule, so politicians will have interest in change as a form of answer this demand, the public demand, and to preserve legitimacy and public support. So politicians need to keep the popular trust and the vote. So they will reform because the public agenda, because that public demand. But this is one of the many hypotheses, and the other one is rational choice for parties in a competition. This way. I don't have the last answer yet. Sorry.
We are very sorry, but we have to stop here. Additional question will be answered with the coffee break. So we have 5 minutes coffee break right now before the next part. Thank you.